Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Cash That. This is your host, Joe Delara, and we are a full week into the NBA season, and it's been a blast. There's been a lot of ups and downs, a lot of weird injury news, obviously the huge gambling scandal in terms of the Terry Rozier indictment, the Chauncey Billups indictment. I can talk about that a little bit here as well, but I do want to touch on some of the major things that we've seen over the past week. And the number one thing to me is that we're seeing Oklahoma City once again just absolutely demolish teams, but not really in the same way. They're 5-0, but it hasn't felt quite as good. They're still number one in defensive rating, number one in adjusted net rating. It's been a little bit tougher. They've been dealing with not having Jalen Williams. At Holmgren's missing a game or two here or there, and Shea is still doing Shea things. They've won a couple games in overtime, double overtime, and they've been able to kind of squeak out some of those wins. I do wonder if there's going to be any type of regression for them, but definitely something to kind of keep an eye on as the season progresses. And then we are starting to see some of these other teams struggle a little bit out of the gate. And one of those teams is the Boston Celtics, 1-3 to start the year. Really tough start for them. And, we've seen the Brooklyn Nets just be absolutely abysmal. Tough watch, tough to even watch them play. And another team is the Indiana Pacers, who are somehow getting even more banged up. Just absolutely brutal run of injuries for them as they've come off this NBA Finals berth they had last year, but they've really, really struggled to stay healthy. So a couple of moving pieces. The Orlando Magic also don't look great to start the year, but it has been an interesting week so far, and there's obviously plenty of more basketball, so we don't want to overreact completely to anything that we've seen in just 1 week. But let's start off with a couple of best bets. So my favorite bet of the slate is Donovan Mitchell over 27.5 points against the Boston Celtics. Just has absolutely torched them over the past couple seasons. Last year scored 35, 35, 31, and 41 points against the Celtics. He scored 30 plus in 3 of 4 games this season. And the Celtics are getting destroyed by these top guards. Brunson, Edgecombe, Maxey, Cade all put monster performances together against them. And when we look at this Cleveland team, they're going to be even a little bit more shorthanded without Sam Merrill. So I think it's a great spot for Donovan Mitchell to really put his stamp on this game against the Boston Celtics, a matchup that he has continued to really get up for on a consistent basis. And I like this at 27.5 points. When I said it, I actually sent it in the huddle at -110, -112. Now, I think the best line at the time of this recording is -120 at Bet365. I would play this up to 30 plus, but I would want plus money on it and really don't have any issues if you wanted to ladder it to maybe even 35 plus. I think it's a really good matchup against Boston. Even though Boston's playing a relatively slow pace, I do think this is just a great matchup for him as a lead guard, especially without Sam Merrill, to take up a couple threes, a couple spacing shots. I think that Mitchell's going to get even more opportunity than he normally would in this game against the Celtics. The next play that I was looking at was I'm looking at the matchup between the Denver Nuggets and New Orleans Pelicans. And one of the things about this game that's interesting is obviously Zion's on the injury report, but Jokic, I made the mistake of fading a Jokic prop the other day, and I bet under 12.5 rebounds, and he had 19, and sometimes that just happens. But here, I do think it's a good matchup for him from a triple-double or like a rebounds plus assist perspective. Last season, he really torched this Pelicans defense, triple-double in 2 of 3 games, he basically averaged one too, and he had 23, 24, and 18 RA. He only had 10 dimes in each game, though, but I do think that if you can get triple-double at maybe like plus 150, plus 160, that's not a bad look for Jokic. The points have kind of come down every so often here. The scoring has been diversified, I think, throughout this Denver Nuggets team. And I think he's trying to take like a step back in the offensive side of the ball and try to spread things around, make sure everybody else is eating, and make everybody comfortable, especially with the addition of Cam Johnson. So I think that offense is going to really start humming as the season progresses. And they're a team that I really do like to contend for an NBA title this season. So against this matchup against the Pelicans, where Zion Williamson may not even play, I think it's a great spot for Nikola Jokic to really find some success. Another game and another play that I am considering is when I'm looking at the slate and I'm looking at the Indiana Pacers against the Dallas Mavericks. I think that this could be a good Cooper Flag game. Part of why I think that is the Pacers are just down like pretty bad. I know that they're getting bet right now. They opened at 7.5-point underdogs. They're now down to 6.5-point underdogs. But I think that has more to do with the Dallas Mavericks kind of struggling a little bit. Plus, there's a number of players for Dallas on the injury report. But I do think that Indiana is dealing with so many injuries. Now, Nembhard is on the report. You're going to be missing Obi Toppin, Benedict Mathurin. They're really just getting so far down on the roster that maybe this is a good spot for Cooper Flag to have that breakout rookie performance and kind of put his stamp on his rookie season, or at least the start of the rookie season. So that's something that I want to keep an eye out for. Haven't seen any props for this game yet, but that's definitely the angle that I would be kind of considering in that game. For the Atlanta Hawks versus the Brooklyn Nets, this is a game where the Nets are one of the worst constructed teams I've ever seen in my life. This is not a good basketball team. They are bad in pretty much every single metric up and down. They're 30th in adjusted defense. They're 29th in adjusted offense, 30th in adjusted net rating. They are playing at a really slow pace, third pace in the league at 99.3. And it's just not like the most enjoyable watch here. But I do think that leads us to a situation where we can back Trae Young and the Atlanta Hawks. So Trae, I'm going to guess his assist line is set at 10.5 for this game. He had 12 in all three games against the Brooklyn Nets last season, October, in March, and in April. Brooklyn is allowing the most assists per game to their opponents. And I think this is just an excellent spot for him to really slice and dice them. Amen Thompson just had one of his better games of this season against the Brooklyn Nets. And I think that Trae Young is really going to be able to find a lot of success. Part of the problem with this Brooklyn team is that they're not the most disciplined defensively. And what I like about what Atlanta can do offensively is they have so many different wings, so many different rangy type of players, so many different players that can cut and move without the basketball. That's the exact type of matchup for Trae Young to really find a lot of success. So especially as a facilitator where, you have the Jalen Johnsons, the Dyson Daniels, the Nickeil Alexander Walkers, cutting, moving without the basketball, getting good looks, getting good opportunities. And then, you have Onyeka Okongwu rolling to the rim. Kristaps Porzingis obviously able to beat, and is kind of like a mismatch nightmare for some of these teams too. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity for Atlanta to put up a big offensive performance. And at the end of the day, that means Trae Young's going to be racking up a bunch of assists. So I like Trae Young over 10.5 assists. And I would probably ladder this up a little bit. I might even go as high as 15, 16 and just, sprinkle those top numbers, but see how high we could go. The biggest concern here is obviously that it is a massive Atlanta Hawks blowout. But when we look at the spread, it's 8.5. It's not like a double-digit spread or anything like that. I think that they don't have Atlanta power ranked as high, especially because Atlanta's on the road here. So I do think it's a game where as long as Brooklyn can stay within, shooting distance, there is plenty of opportunity for Trae Young to rack up an absolute boatload of assists. Again, reminder, if you guys are enjoying this type of content, be sure to like, subscribe, rate, and review. Leave us a comment too as well down below if you have any questions or if there's anything that you want to hear me talk about in a future episode or, potentially in the Discord or on Twitter as well. The next game that I'm turning to is the Portland Trailblazers versus the Utah Jazz. And one player that's been really outstanding, I think, in this new role with his new team is Jrue Holiday. And I'm going to be targeting over 24.5 points, rebounds, and assists. It's been over this in every single game. And the biggest thing for Jrue is that the shot volume is actually there. He's taken double-digit field goal attempts in every single game this season, which is a little bit of a surprise because we weren't seeing that level of consistency last season or really over the past couple seasons with the Boston Celtics. And now I think as a leader for this Portland Trailblazers team, and running the offense. I'm not sure if maybe there's been some conversations with either him about if he's going to be there long term, if he's a piece that they're going to try to flip. I'm not 100% sure on that end, but they certainly are showcasing him, and he's getting an expanded role, which I think has been incredibly important. Then when we look at the matchup itself, Utah is again not a particularly strong team. On the season, they are 28th in adjusted net, 28th in adjusted offense, 29th in adjusted defense. They play at a pretty slow pace, but I do think that the Portland Trailblazers, who are playing the seventh fastest pace in the league, are going to be able to speed them up just a bit. Additionally, Jrue, excellent rebounder for a guard, strong facilitator as well. I think that we're going to see plenty of opportunities for Jrue to fill up the box score. He's had some pretty even distribution nights here as well. And when we look at his stats throughout the course of this season, he's had 14, 12, 21, and 24 points. So the points have really spiked. But the assists, 7, 11, 7, and 6. And the rebounds, 6, 5, 6, and 5. So the floor is extremely high in really all of these stats, but there is ceiling potential in, especially at least in the points and in the assists. But the rebounds also have an ability to go over his 4.5 line, which he's also gone over in every single game this season. So I like the idea of bringing these together. I like the idea of using the combo prop for Jrue as somebody that has been able to, or somebody that is going to be able to have some success against this Portland, or rather against this Utah Jazz team. So I like Jrue Holiday in this spot. Looking at another game here, I think that Ja Morant should be able to have a strong game against the Phoenix Suns. The Suns struggling out of the gate. Devin Booker has had a hell of a time here, turning the ball over a lot this season. So Devin Booker turnovers is definitely something that we could take a look at as well. Checking on this particular matchup, the Suns are giving up and surrendering a ton of assists to, especially the lead guards. So I think that this is an opportunity when you're playing this Phoenix team who's basically just reinserted the Hornets, the old Hornets bigs. I think there is a lot of opportunity for Ja in that pick and roll, as they kind of are going to be in a little bit of a drop, to both assist for his teammates if they start throwing doubles or if they start coming up on that. And then also for him to score as well. PA for Ja Morant, I think is a pretty good look. And I think I would even play some double-double depending on what the price is. But I'd want at least 2-1 to play double-double. But I do think that it's a good opportunity for Morant to have a great game against this Phoenix Suns team. As for Devin Booker, he's had 6, 3, 9, and 2 turnovers so far this season. His line is at 3.5. Against this Memphis Grizzlies team, I don't mind looking at an over 3.5. I do think that they are going to be able to swarm him. I do think that they're going to be able to push and put a lot of pressure on Devin Booker. And I think Dylan Brooks popped on the injury report. They're still without Jalen Green. So the ball is really going to be in his hands a ton during this game. And there's a lot of opportunity for him to, make certain mistakes, turn the ball over, especially against a Grizzlies team that is playing with relative pace here. On the season, Memphis is playing at the second fastest pace in the league. So pace up opportunity. And it's a spot where I think that they can force a couple extra turnovers. The defense is middling for Memphis, but when you have players like Jaren Jackson Jr. or John Morant can kind of pick your pocket too, and same with Jalen Wells, there's plenty of opportunity to turn the ball over if you're Devin Booker. One of the biggest injury news pieces that we're dealing with right now is Anthony Edwards is going to be missing the next week and a half, 2 weeks with that hamstring injury. And when we look at Minnesota, we have to kind of assess, how does that impact the team? How does that impact some of the rotations? What does that do for this Minnesota team? And when we kind of break it down, I always like to look at it from a couple different perspectives. I like to look at it from a game flow type of perspective. What are the rotations looking like? What are the minutes going to start looking like? Who's playing with who's starting? And then how does Edwards not being on the floor impact some of the other primary players? So last game was the first game without Anthony Edwards. And honestly, we can look at the game prior to that a bit too, because that was the game that he was hurt and he wound up leaving just a couple minutes into the game. So when Ant checked out of the game that he got hurt in, they put in Bones Highland, and Bones Highland wound up playing a pretty big chunk of minutes here. in this game, played almost 20 minutes in that game that he first got hurt, which I thought was then interesting because in the next game, played only about 15 minutes, didn't check in until the start of the second quarter against the Denver Nuggets. It is notable, I think, that they made a switch where Mike Conley then started instead of coming off the bench in this most recent game without Anthony Edwards when they had a little bit of game plan or game time to kind of facilitate that. I will say that the rotation from last game, I expect to change a little bit. One player that wound up checking out very, very early was Dante DiVincenzo. Dante DiVincenzo picked up 2 fouls in under 3 minutes to start that game, and then wound up playing 9 minutes, basically the entire second quarter, given that. So he was pretty solid in that quarter, put up 2 rebounds, 2 assists, and it looks like 9 points as well in that second quarter in those 11 minutes. So really had a strong second quarter, then, wasn't able to kind of convert on some of the looks that he was getting. But I do think that when we kind of check it from I like the sample size isn't enormous right now, but looking at some of the stats this year when players are on the floor with Anthony Edwards versus off the floor, or when Ant's off the floor rather. And the guy that really pops in terms of what do we see from an additional scoring perspective is Naz Reid. When Naz Reid is on the floor with Anthony Edwards, 14 points per 100 possessions. When he's on the floor without Anthony Edwards, 27 points per 100 possessions without Anthony Edwards. And I think that that's notable here because we did not see Naz Reid enter the starting lineup. We continue to see Naz Reid off the bench. And he's playing some minutes with Julius Randle, but he's also playing some minutes without Julius Randle, which I think is also important. So that way there's a little bit less overlap there. And when we look at the minutes with and without Julius Randle, the key here, though, is that Naz Reid doesn't really see a major change. He's at about 22 and a half with him and 23 and a half without Julius Randle. And that's what we're seeing this year. And then even if we looked at last year's stats, we're basically looking at the same thing, only a moderate bump without Julius Randle compared to the swings that he has with and without Anthony Edwards. I think a lot of that has to do with some of the rotations that they can run, some of the actions that they can run, and some of the things that you're looking for Naz to do. Randle is obviously a little bit more of a facilitator when given the opportunity, and he's been able to take advantage of that. The difference isn't as stark in when you kind of include last year's stats for Naz Reid with and without Edwards, but it is still a pretty significant spike from 23 to 29 points per 100 possessions. So I'm going to be looking for Naz Reid props in this game. The other thing I think from this year's perspective that I think is important is we need to look at some of the usage, because usage is going to show you whether or not there was a scoring uptick. And when we're looking at these smaller sample sizes, I think usage is a little bit more indicative of how much they're actually going to have the ball in their hands, how much they're actually going to be played. Naz still sees this big jump from 11.8% usage to 25.6% usage. The other players that are seeing that type of jump are Johnny Juzang, 6 minutes overall, Rob Dillingham, 13 minutes overall, Leonard Miller, 7 minutes, and then Bones Highland basically never plays with Anthony Edwards, only 9 minutes with him compared to 50 minutes without him. So in order for us to get to anybody else that has real significant usage change, we're looking at Rudy Gobert, who has a 50% less significant usage change with and without Anthony Edwards. And I think that kind of makes some sense when we think about how they're generating shots, how they're generating opportunities. I would have expected Randle and Dante DiVincenzo to see bigger spikes, and they don't. So I think that that's notable too. I wouldn't be running to go bet overs on Dante or Julius Randle just because Anthony Edwards is out. I understand that Randle had a great game last time out without Ant, and Dante still is going to get plenty of opportunity. But the player that I think is most important to target here is going to be Naz Reid. I'm going to see if they finally posted a line for him yet, but I haven't seen one per se. Oh, here we go. So I'm looking at a 13.5 for Naz Reid. That's something I'm going to be taking. I really like the look here. I think it's a really good opportunity. I think it's a really good matchup for Naz. And especially against this Lakers team where, you're kind of dealing with DeAndre Ayton, you're dealing with Jackson Hayes. I think this is an excellent spot for him. to really excel. So when we look at this too, without Anthony Edwards over the last season, in 3 games without Anthony Edwards last year, he scored 8 points, 23 points, and 27 points. And then this season, he scored 18 against the Denver Nuggets. But even if we remove that and you look at the game where Ant got hurt, we're at 16 and 18. So I think that this 13 is definitely a bit too light. And that's pretty widely available right now. I'm seeing a minus 103 on DraftKings, though, as the best line. So I'm going to be jumping all over that. I think it's an excellent spot against this Lakers team. And I think the other thing that's kind of important is that Nas does still play in some of these games that get like a little bit out of hand. And, Chris Finch is willing to ride the hot hand at times. And when Nas gets hot, he's somebody that he doesn't really necessarily want to take off the court. So I'm going to be grabbing Nas over 13.5. We bet him the other day at 11.5, and then that got juiced to hell. I think it got bet up all the way to 13.5 anyway. So really good opportunity for us, and I'm going to be backing Nas Reed at over 13.5 points. Finally, looking at the slate here, it's a pretty interesting slate. It is not, the craziest slate that we've ever seen, but I do think that we've had a lot of opportunities here to kind of find some plays that we like or don't like. One spot, though, is Amen Thompson over 11.5 rebounds plus assists. I'd go a little bit lighter on this. I do think it's a good spot against the Raptors, though, with Jakob Poeltl being listed as doubtful for this game. I think there's going to be plenty of assist opportunities, rebound opportunities. This is a team that does tend to allow a lot of assists as well. So good spot for Amen Thompson. Just had a good confidence boosting game against the Brooklyn Nets. So I think this is a good spot for him against the Toronto Raptors. The last point that I'll kind of talk about is the Orlando Magic and the Detroit Pistons are playing each other. I think that both of these teams are really, kind of been a bit underwhelming on the season. One of the things with Detroit, though, is a little bit easier to explain, right? You don't have Malik Beasley, who, despite, obviously with the gambling issues or allegations, you basically took out a guy that was making 3 to 4 threes a game on really, really efficient volume, coming off the bench about 18 points a game. And you basically just removed that and didn't replace it with anything. Jaden Ivey's still out. I think Detroit will get better when they get a little bit healthier, but definitely an issue for them. And then with Desmond Bane, I'm curious to see how this goes in Orlando. I kind of alluded to it before, but I do wonder, when we talked about Desmond Bane with his advanced metrics for the Memphis Grizzlies, it was like he wound up almost being like a net neutral when you looked at a lot of the positive lineups or the best lineups for Memphis. And some of the best lineups didn't even include Desmond Bane. So I do wonder if what Orlando brought him in to do, which was obviously to kind of fix some of the shooting issues, to provide a little bit of facilitating, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder if they overestimated what his impact could be, especially when you have 2 other relatively ball dominant players in Paolo Banchero and Franz Wagner. And if he's not able to, really get massive run, I think he still slots in really well, but you're paying him and expecting him to almost behave or act like a number 2 when he's really closer to almost like a 3 or a 4 on this team in terms of the hierarchy. So definitely something to kind of keep an eye on and something to consider, but something that I'm kind of treading with, trying to figure that out. One thing, so then I'm going to transition to a little bit of talk on this indictment or on these indictments. And I'm not going to talk about it too legally, but I am going to just kind of explain it a little bit. So there were 2 indictments that came down. One is related to poker and illegal poker games and essentially defrauding or scamming people. And then the other one it includes a couple of different allegations in terms of betting impropriety. And I think that the poker one is easier to talk about first because I think it's pretty straightforward. The poker one is basically saying, I think that there was some stuff that people would find interesting in terms of the technology that was being used. And obviously, they were saying that they were using X-ray scanners for the shoe at the tables. They had X-ray glasses or infrared glasses or some sort of glow in the dark glasses that you could see print on the cards so you could know what cards everybody had. There was some signaling between different people, and there were a lot of different celebrities, especially professional athletes, that were named or included in some of those poker games, whether it was used to either scam them or the players were unbeknownst to them. Maybe they were being bankrolled. Maybe it was like, hey, we're going to give you $100,000. I have fun with it. If you lose, you lose. It's on us. Like we're gonna get our cut anyway. If you win, then you keep the profits, but we'll get our basis back or that type of thing. And I do wonder if basically like they were used as an ad. You get an opportunity to play poker with any of these NBA players or NFL players or professionals or athletes, whatever it is, and people find value in that, so they want to be there. So there was a lot of scamming going on in that regard, and they're saying through the indictment that this has mafia ties through a number of the crime families in New York. So that's that indictment. And the most notable part for NBA fans is obviously that Chauncey Billups was a named defendant in that indictment, along with about like 24 other people. For the other indictment relating to the sports betting, this one is a little bit more interesting. It's a little bit narrower in terms of who is charged. And I think that there are a couple of different questions that the federal government is going to have to sort through and they're going to have to prove. The one thing between both of these indictments, I should say, is that the overarching charges are essentially wire fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering offenses. So essentially, I'm going to try to summarize what wire fraud is for you, but essentially it's a federal crime that is a scheme to defraud somebody using like the internet, the phone, the radio, or TV. And it's essentially that you're going to use false pretenses to do so. So it really is very wide and all encompassing. So there are, I'm really, really breaking it down here. This is not like the legal definition per se, but I'm trying to give you an idea of what exactly it means. So that's essentially what they're charged with. And for the Rozier indictment, we'll just call it that, there's a couple different things within it that I think are interesting. First, you have the case of Terry Rozier, where they're saying, and the allegation is basically that he gave information that he was going to basically quit on a game and not play his traditional rotation. He was going to check out, and that people should bet like unders. Then you have other cases so there's that. Then you have a different type. You have like two that are a little bit closer to each other than that, but two different types of information that gets out. And the information in those is that one was that a coach, and this was the interesting thing because I'm not going to say that this is the same person as in the other indictment, but it talks about a coach, or a person who was an NBA player, is a coach, and then it talks about the Portland Trailblazers, and it talks about how this person who's listed as a co-conspirator but not named is essentially indicated that certain players weren't going to play because the team was tanking. Now, that is one situation. Then you have another situation with a assistant coach on the Lakers, and there's two different times where information is passed, and he's paid for this information. One time, he says that the game is against the Milwaukee Bucks, and that a certain player is not going to play. It's not been listed on the injury report yet, but that the bet should be on the Milwaukee Bucks. Player gets ruled out. The Bucks steamroll the Lakers as 6-point underdogs. The line obviously flipped when this player was ruled out, and then Milwaukee just dominated. That player, through speculation, has been identified as LeBron James, which is a person that would obviously affect the spread to that degree. The next thing that was interesting then was there was another case or another instance where these people paid this same coach allegedly paid this coach for information. And in that time, he hit them up and said, I have information. He's paid for it. There's an exchange, right? And the information is that essentially LeBron and Anthony Davis are not going to play. They're listed on the injury report, but they're both going to sit. So even though there already is like a preliminary tag on the injury report that would impact people's ability to say like, well, I think they're going to play. I don't think they're going to play. People kind of make their guesses. We do this and we interpret injury reports all the time. You hear me talking about it all the time. The difference in this case and the weird thing here is that they actually wound up both playing. The information was wrong. The Lakers won. The Lakers covered. And then the people that bought that information were pissed off about it. And essentially, they wanted a refund. He didn't give the refund. He was like, I gave you the information that I had. It was correct at the time. Now, this has led us to some of the injury reporting comments that have come out and the NBA saying we need to have injury report clarity a little bit better, which I think they do need to do. If the NBA could rule players out at the time of tip, they would, like after the tip. And when you go, why is this guy not starting? Or if it's a bench player, why are they not coming in? They'd be like, oh yeah, he's not playing today. If the NBA could do that, they would love to do that. The teams anyway. So, but now that, you have so much betting involved, it's hard to have that type of parameter still or to fall under those old rules, right? So I wouldn't be surprised to see a change in that regard. But going back to these indictments and this indictment in particular, part of the thing that I thought was most interesting is when we read the indictment and when we talk about what the indictment actually says, the indictment talks about how these bets are fraudulent wagers. And what I think is interesting is that it says that the inside information makes the bets fraudulent. Now, this is something that has kind of been put forward by, I think, the sports books in a way, because the sports books started introducing language recently about how if there was non-public information that the sports books set a line on, like not knowing that if that information became public later, they could essentially void those bets because the bets weren't fair. Like they didn't have a fair representation of what the situation was. I think this is very tough language for a couple different reasons. And one of which is that if it was the other way around, where if a sports book had better information than the average consumer that, maybe wasn't super public, but then somebody else, maybe they had somebody that knew, or they had a better read of the injury report, or they had an eye in at shoot around and they were like, oh, this guy's not at shoot around. Is there a duty then on the sportsbook side to say, well, we have this non-public information. Do we need to disseminate it? Do we need to make it public? And also, at what point does something become public information? Is it only when Shams or Woj or Chris Haynes or, somebody to that effect, sends out the information? Or is it, you file a beat reporter and, maybe they only have a couple thousand followers and then they start publishing information. Does that make it public information? It's created a little bit of a slippery slope. I do think that these are different in terms of what happened. And then there's obviously layers to this. There's layers to this duty. And there's layers to, who can say what. Most of these people, though, if you're working for an NBA team, whether you're a player or coach or anything, right? Those people, I would believe, have duties to comply with the rules and regulations of the NBA, which involves accurate injury reporting, for example. If this goes further, though, I think it starts to beg the question, and I think you can also tell based on this to a degree, there's 5 people charged, or I'm sorry, 6 people charged in the Rozier indictment. And what's interesting here, though, is that these people all seem to be involved in either the dissemination of the information, the rigging of certain events, or the direct buying and influence of that information, right? There's nobody charged that's downstream from that, where, if you talk to Damon Jones and Damon Jones gave the information to John Doe, and then John Doe just happened to give the information to somebody else further down the line, it does start to beg a question of whether those people are culpable or not, because there's nothing inherently illegal about having information. If this information became public, I do wonder, if at some point prior to the game, even though they had a conspiracy to commit this type of fraud, it does beg the question of, well, is there anything actionable then? It probably never would have come to light, obviously, if it became a wider spread thing where everybody knew about it. But definitely some interesting things going on, definitely some interesting legal questions about this case and about how it's going to be prosecuted. You do wonder, the timing of these two are interesting because obviously, aside from some of the overlap in terms of the people, they're not inherently intertwined. They're both betting related, but the way that it was even presented to the public is that these are 2 indictments that are naturally interrelated. And there's really not any overlap besides what some of the commentary is and what some of the connections are when you start putting some of the pieces together. So I'm very curious to see how this turns out. I'm very curious to see how this moves moving forward. But I'm most curious about what kind of impact this has on the betting public and what we get to be able to do from a betting perspective. And there's been some comments and some call for people saying, well, we should take away unders. Like, you shouldn't be able to bet on unders for players, or you shouldn't be able to bet on player props. I don't think that any of those are actually tenable for the average consumer. Number one, most people these days, when I talk to them about betting, I mean, in part because I talk mostly about player props, but the average person wants to bet on player props. I don't really have as many conversations, even with my friends that are more casual, saying, hey, I really want to bet this spread, or like, I want to bet this run line. That's not really the conversation. It's who's hitting a home run, who's stealing a base, who's hitting getting a triple double, who's scoring a touchdown. Like, that's what people want to see. That's what people want to bet on, right? And that's something that everybody thinks that they have a little bit of an expertise in through whether it's fantasy sports or watching their team. And they go, I think that this player is going to do X because this is a good matchup for them. And a lot of people like that. They like that type of content. They like doing that. Also, a lot of those player props are what lend themselves to parlays. And we see the sports books peppering us with ads of somebody turned $10 into $100,000. They're advertising that because most people lose those bets and they're making a lot of money on that. So sports books aren't going to want that to go away. And from the not being able to bet on unders, that's really bad for the consumer in particular. Besides the fact that even if it's regulated on sports books, how do you regulate that on an exchange? You really can't. And there's been a widespread growth in exchanges and peer-to-peer betting, right? So that's something that is going to have to be looked at, where now you're driving it off of the regulated sportsbooks that you wanted and now onto direct peer-to-peer exchanges, which have benefits and they have pros and cons, right? Because if you have some people that are a little bit more casual, probably gonna get eaten alive on those. There's a reason that some of those times when you go line shopping and you say like, oh, that's the best line and it's on this exchange. There's a reason for that for the most part. And that's something that the average person might not necessarily be able to kind of keep an eye on. So I think that without having unders though, on sports books, it leaves us in a situation where, like in the summer league, for example, for the NBA, you see prop lines that are 10 plus, 15 plus, 20 plus, and there's no real policing on what the price is. You'd look at it and you could see it on one book, 15 plus is minus 110. And you can see on another book that 15 plus is plus 200. And you could say, how is this having this different of a hold? We don't normally see that with a player prop that you would say, this should be like the baseline. You don't see that type of discrepancy. So without unders, sportsbooks can put out some pretty juiced lines. The holds, I think, are going to be bigger. And I think that that's a much worse product for the consumer overall. So that's my thought on the situation. And, I'll continue to keep tabs on these cases and try to let you know, at least from my perspective, what the documents are saying. It's obviously not legal advice, but I do think that it is at least a way to summarize some of it and give it to you guys where you can digest what's going on from the legal perspective, but then also what's even being alleged. So I'm going to keep trying to do that. Now, for quick little pods and recs at the end of the show, I am going to make a recommendation that what did I get? I just got, number one, I always recommend food. I had stuffed peppers today and it was absolutely fantastic. But I do also appreciate a good unstuffed pepper. It's literally just everything, just not in the pepper. You just chop up the pepper and then put it in there. And then I think that's fantastic. You'd always put it over pasta or something if you wanted to, but I feel like most stuffed peppers have rice in them anyways, so you don't need to do that. So I would recommend that. And then I'm also going to recommend one of the things that I kind of learned this like recently, and there's obviously the proliferation of AI, whether it's ChatGPT, Grok, Gemini, whatever. I think one of the best uses is actually for coupon codes. And if you're going to go buy something, especially if it's kind of expensive, just type in just like, is there a coupon code for this, or price shop this for me and find the best price. So that's one thing that I found to be really effective. And I think it's a great tool. You're not cheating. You're not taking, you're not having to take a test for you. You're not having to write a legal brief for you. But I do think that it is a nice tool to use to kind of be able to save a couple bucks, especially with Christmas coming up and with all the sales coming in with, Black Friday, obviously. I feel like now Black Friday is for like a fucking month. and you're able to maybe get a better deal on something that you either wanted or you need to get for somebody else. So those are the recommendations. Eat stuffed peppers, unstuffed peppers. Use some AI to get better deals on whatever you're buying. I think it's definitely worth it. So you're gonna have a little bit more money there in your pocket, and then we can use that on our bets, and we can continue to cash that.